Thank you very much. Thank you, Joe Baque. And let me tell you something. I still love Joe Baque a whole hell of a lot. He's in my heart, and he's in all our hearts. And he still owes me $5.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I want to say a big thank you to all of you who came tonight. This is a wonderful thing. And also a big thank you to the crew of the Washington Center for making it possible. Thank you all. You know who you are, right? Okay. Also to my good friend Claudia Lewis, who is in the back with a pink shirt. She helped me a lot in putting this together when I really needed it. And she also designed, I want to give her credit for that wonderful gobo there. We first saw that at Joe's 80th birthday party, which was also right here in the black box. So that was a little sentimental value for us too. Also want to thank our son John. Is John in here? Are you? Yes, who somehow juggled impossible workloads to coordinate with the center and handle, frankly, a whole lot more than he had time for. I love you, honey. And to Steve Lucino, where are you, Steve? Who gathered and coordinated the wonderful band you just heard. And sans the piano, you probably noticed, and that was deliberate because who could follow up after Joe, right? But all the players are dear compatriots of Joe and friends. I want to introduce them. Tommy Russell on woodwinds. Thank you so much, Tommy. And Dave McCrary on trumpet. Where's Dave? And Mike McQuigg on guitar. And Michael Olson on drum. Thank you all for tonight and for all of your lifetime with Joe here in Olympia. We love you. We love you all. And thank you again to everyone for coming. And remembering Joe tonight and maybe after tonight too. Yeah. I'm going to introduce a few people to say a few words about Joe. I kind of curated the list of speakers to include people that could illustrate and talk about the different facets of Joe. And he had, as most of you know, a whole lot of facets that were just wonderful. First speaker is a person who is closer to Joe musically, I think, than anyone I ever knew. They played many gigs together, and during the pandemic, he and Mike came over to our house to play with Joe so that he was still playing, even though all the venues for gigs were closed. When Joe would swing something really great or play a particularly satisfying riff, Steve would get an appreciative and admiring smile on his face, and then Joe would return it. It was just wonderful. It was my favorite part of their performances. Steve Lucino.
Thanks, Carol, and everybody for being such great friends with Joe. We all treasured our time with him, I know, and we're going to miss him, and we do miss him. I was fortunate to be close to him through the music, and he would give me music lessons impromptu when I needed them, which was often. And hopefully some of these lessons have sunk in. I really hope so, because they were valuable lessons to me. And so I'm just going to talk about a few of the many. There were so many, but I'll list a few of them. Music lesson number 1, make the touch on your instrument gentle but firm, like a lover's touch. Music lesson number 2, expose your gut, be vulnerable, and that means we'll trust each other. Lesson number 3, Stevie, check your ego at the door. Music lesson number 4, it is always possible to make a good connection with people. It's rare, however, when that connection is both deep and easy, and you got to recognize that when it occurs and hold on to it. 5th music lesson, thinking is dangerous. And some of you may have heard that also from Jack Percival. That was one of his lessons also, the great Jack Percival, who was such a good friend with Joe. Music lesson number 6. Most music jobs, the conversations of the people at the tables is really the solo. The job of the band there is to accompany that solo, that conversation, to encourage civilized behavior and to affect the vibe positively. The 7th music lesson. When I would express doubts about my ability or my performance at some point, Joe would say, stop the self-punishment, enough. That was a big lesson. It still is. There were so many lessons. Put away the whip. That's right. That was how it. Stop the self-punishment. Put away the whip. So I'll say one more. There were so many music lessons, and they were all significant. But this one might be one of the most significant that I received from Joe, again, repeatedly, so that it would sink in. And Joe was not known to use foul language. So when he used like a New York City colorful phrase, it was to emphasize the importance of what he was saying. I'm going to use the phrase so-and-so, but you can insert a New York City colorful phrase when you hear the so-and-so, if you so choose. Remember, Stevie, you ain't the only so-and-so on the bandstand. Thank you all, and thank you, Carol.
Thanks so much, Steve. Joe had a special and unselfish talent for framing others musically, especially singers. He and Denise were a very special combination of skill, of experience, appreciation, and musicality. Denise is a classically trained singer who has performed in operatic productions, taught vocal performance at PLU for many years, and has an active vocal studio here. She's also, and her family, a really good friend. Denise DeVerso.
Hi, everybody. Almost 20 years ago, I called Joe to ask if he would give some coaching to one of my students. I accompanied her to that session. Later that evening, I got a call from him, and he asked about me. Who was I? I said, I'm a classical singer and teacher. I sing Bach, Mozart, Debussy. He said, I can play Bach, Mozart, and Debussy. Now, I had heard him play many times, and I was a little surprised. A couple years later, I had just finished a gig singing solos in a concert performance of Porgy and Bess. That reminded me of how much I love Gershwin and the American Songbook. I thought that Joe might help me bridge my singing from classical to something else. He remembered me, and at our first session, he declared in his New York accent, which I will not try to duplicate, "You're an Arlen singer." I knew who Arlen was, but I really didn't know what Joe meant. For the next 15 years or so, I coached with Joe. He picked most of the songs, including a lot of Arlen's songs. We met every week, and almost every time I walked in, he was at his beautiful Chickering piano, playing Bach and Debussy. He had to tell me countless times, put away the whip, because I was so hard on myself. He was incredibly patient and always kind. He must have known I was seeking his approval, and he was very generous when something I sang pleased him. And if it didn't, he never said anything. But I could tell by the look on his face that I hadn't quite hit the mark. I don't know if any of you know what that look is, but he gave me song after song. We spent endless hours talking about the words, the composers, the music, the phrasing. It was a glorious collaboration. We had our own unique musical friendship. I have so many incredible memories of our time together. At one point, Joe and I made an album's worth of arrangements. We recorded at a studio in Seattle. Now, we were both pretty skilled performers, so we didn't do more than 2 or 3 takes per song. We did 1 take, and his piano solo in that was just extraordinary. He just made it up on the spot. I hadn't heard it before. The recording engineer was blown away by Joe's playing. Without doubt, one of the highlights of my life was making that album with Joe. I don't know if most of you know that Joe played the accordion. One time, I got a gig at an Italian restaurant, and I wanted to sing a few Italian songs in Italian. Joe pulled out his accordion, and we made some incredible arrangements of those songs. A lot of them he knew from playing as a kid, bar mitzvahs and weddings and things. He was so versatile and had so much musical depth. He enjoyed telling me about his early musical training. His teacher, I can't remember the name, was a German man, was a student of Arnold Schoenberg. It then made a lot of sense that Joe was so accomplished in theory and piano technique. I once asked him how he got so good at transposing. He must have known 1,000 songs and all the words, and he could transpose all of them. He said whenever he learned a new song, he learned it in all 12 keys. Seattle Opera presented an opera called Erwartung, which means expectation, by Schoenberg. It is atonal music, 1 singer and orchestra. I saw it and I loved it. The staging of the opera was like watching a Salvador Dali painting come to life. I told Joe about it and he was very interested. I asked him if he'd like to see it, and he said enthusiastically, yes. I went again with him, and he loved it too. Not many people would ever want to go to a German expressionist opera, but Joe did. And Joe loved singers. He would always say before a performance, "I've got you. No matter what you do, I'll be there." That trust that Steve talked about. It's pure heaven to sing with someone who actually listens to what you're doing. We had a terrific bond, listening to each other and responding to each other while singing and playing. Our musical conversations. No matter how many times we repeated songs, they were never exactly the same. It all depended on the mood, the variation of expression. To sing with someone like that, I cannot emphasize how rare it is. I've experienced it only 2 or 3 times in my life. Joe told me about when he got his first piano at the age of 12, the Chickering. It has such a beautiful tone, always kept in perfect tune. He told me about one of his first gigs as a sideman. He must have been very young as he was admonished by the horn player for getting in the way with too much piano playing. I loved hearing Joe's stories. During breaks in our sessions, I would say, "Joe, tell me a story from the old days." He'd think for a moment, then give me one. My favorite was probably when his band got a gig on Long Island, playing for some swells on New Year's Eve. They played in a huge mansion, a stage set up in the ballroom, but no one was there. They played for hours, and every once in a while, someone streaked by. I just thought that was hilarious. I could just picture that. And then there was an odd story when he played for some other swells at a party in New York. An inebriated guest tried to buy his beret from him. Joe didn't think much of him and kept his hat despite the large sum of money the drunk offered. He told me about how Ella Fitzgerald was a basket case of nerves before a performance. I wouldn't believe it, except that he was there. When I wanted to sing I'm Old-Fashioned, straight, not jazzed up, he said that Jerome Kern would have loved it because Kern didn't like his songs jazzed up. How would he know that unless he actually, knew Kern? He talked about Larry Hart, Rodgers and Hart, and how sad and depressed the man was in his marriage. It helped me understand Hart's lyrics, which were mostly sad, angry, or indifferent. When I had trouble interpreting a couple of Harold Arlen songs, in particular When the Sun Comes Out and I Had Myself a True Love, Joe told me about knowing women that those songs were about when he played in the bars in New York. My 21st century attitude could not relate to any woman that would let a man treat them so badly. Joe said that they were fragile, kind souls. He had great compassion for all people. I understood, and I had compassion for them too. That cleared a path for me that was very meaningful in all of my interpretations of singing. My life, my music, and my teaching are so much richer and enlightened for having Joe Baque as my mentor, my pianist, and my friend. His incredible love for beauty and for all manner of beings was genuine. By the time he came into my life, he was very wise, although I can imagine that he was kind of a wise guy when he was young. His most important words of wisdom: be present. I'm grateful to have a dear friendship with Carol and John, who he loved so very much. He spoke of his love for them every time we met, and that was hundreds of times. I know he's gone from this world, but he will never be gone from this heart.
The outfit I have on has no pockets, so I couldn't bring any Kleenexes with me, so I'll apologize once for that. When Joe moved to Olympia in 1984, he was not thinking about teaching. When the demand rose here, though, he started. He connected with a student, or not, through their curiosity and motivation, and had students of all ages and experience, most on piano, but many of them in composition or arranging. There was a man interested in all those things, a young man of great motivation and talent and joy. He now performs playing several instruments. He sings, he composes music of different cultures, and oh yes, he also rocks a career in technology. Joshua Howe.
Hi, my name is Josh, and I'm a musician. And Joe has a lot to do with why I still am one. I met Joe in the summer of 2004, right before I turned 17. My family had just moved to Olympia after living in Malaysia, and I'd fallen really hard for jazz. And when we asked around town for recommendations for piano teachers, the same name came up time and again: Joe's the guy. And after a brief and somewhat intimidating audition with him, I started weekly lessons with him. He showed me how to walk bass lines, how to play block chords, how to sing with your solos to make them more lyrical, and how to comp behind a horn player in a way that makes them want to hire you again. Joe didn't introduce me to jazz. He welcomed me into the fold. He said, "This is a real book." And then he said, "These changes are better." And when the music felt right, he always said, "Yes, you're doing it, you're swinging." One of my lessons, he asked me, "What are you doing on Tuesday?" And that very next week, on a rainy Olympia night, he ushered me into the back of the Art House in Art Gallery Frame Shop downtown, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where he took me to my first jam session. He played a few tunes with a band. I'm pretty sure, Steve, you were there. And then he had me take my seat at the keys. And clutching my precious real book, I gingerly played through a tune, and I went back a lot. Many years later, I I told him when I booked my first gig as a band leader at Pies and Pints, a now closed restaurant up in Seattle. I was really excited to tell him about it. And his immediate response was, "When's the next one?" And then Joe and Carol both drove all the way up to Seattle to see me play. And when I came off stage, "You're swinging," he said. He came to a lot of my gigs. Sometimes when I hadn't been down to Olympia in a while, I'd call and see how he was doing. He'd always ask, "Are you still playing?" And he would always be so excited, so elated to hear that, yes, of course, Joe, I'm still playing. And the next question, always, "And are you having fun?" Because it was so important to him that playing music was fun. Sometimes I'd ask him back, "You still playing, Joe?" And he'd always say, "Joshua, the day I stop playing is the day I die." I started making records, and I would always bring him a copy, which of course he listened to. And earlier this year, I put out a duo record with a trumpet player friend of mine. I drove down this past March to see him and bring him a copy. He had just turned 100. And he looked over the track listing, and he landed on the second tune, and he asked me, "Is this one yours?" It was, and so Carol put it on the CD player, and we listened to it. And the next tune, and the next. I told him, "Joe, we don't have to keep going. You don't have to listen to the whole thing right now." And he wouldn't hear of it. And he'd say, "You two really have a good thing." After a really, really nice trumpet line. He knows what he's doing. At one point, I tried to attempt some light conversation with Carol, just talking about anything at all. And Joe interrupted really quickly. I'm sorry. Can you please rewind a bit? I missed the last part." And we finished the rest of the record. I don't know why I never asked him before, but that day after we finished the record, I asked to hear a composition of his. And Carol fished out a chart out of the box, and at 100 years old, he laid out a really gorgeous ballad. And it was the last time I heard him play. And I just wanted to thank Joe for loving music and for his generosity in sharing it with me, for connecting me to this world, for always encouraging and believing in me, much, much past our weekly lessons. Thanks.
I don't remember how Brent and Joe met, but their connection was immediate. I do remember that. Brent is a pastor, a writer, a musician, and a student of life, and a student of Joe's. It's Brent Hofer.
I knew when I came up here that I would run into a problem, because with other people sharing, I knew that many of them were going to say, "Thank you, the buttons to my coat." It just fell out. I knew that many people here were going to say exactly what I was going to say about Joe, and so I'm trying to say something new and different here. But I met Joe because he was my piano teacher and also my music composition teacher. He impacted my life greatly. As my mother told him, "You took all the anger out of Brent's playing." He impacted me in such a degree that as I went on, I enjoyed for many years as a worship pastor and music director at churches because of the skills that Joe taught me. However, he did more than teach me music. He taught me significant lessons for life. If you've ever studied under Joe, then you're aware that he was insistent that music could not happen if your ego got in the way. To paraphrase Joe, get out of the way of the music. That was very hard for me to learn. But he taught me that you cannot make music. You're only playing notes if you're thinking about impressing people and winning their approval. And if you're worried about making mistakes, then you're still thinking about you and not the music. And I realized from Joe that whether you're proud or whether you're timid, it's all two sides of the same coin. It's all about you. And you can't make music. You really can't make music if you're just thinking about yourself. Joe brought that to my attention in a fairly dramatic way. The brochure about him and many people about his kindness and his love, but he also spoke the truth to me. During a lesson one time with him, I obviously was trying to win his approval, and he looked at me and simply said, "Do not try and make me your dad." That hurt. It really hurt, but inside I knew that he just told me the truth. My desperate need for Joe's approval only revealed the inside of his wisdom and the weakness in my own personality. Over the years since I studied under Joe, I've become more conscious of seeking others' approval and learning to take steps to move away from that behavior. The lessons I learned from Joe I've seen in the whole of life. If I'm fixated on myself, then I cannot really truly love other people in an authentic way. I'm only playing a facade of living. Selfishness and self-centeredness will block the joy of loving others sincerely. However, if I focus on others, then the joy of genuine relationships can occur. And Joe loved people. And he loved me. And I love Joe. And I look over this crowd here. These are people that were loved by Joe. It wasn't just his piano playing and his musicality, which was incredible, and his talent. But if he would have been arrogant, we would have all known it. And we would have enjoyed listening to him in a club or wherever he was playing at, but we wouldn't want to hang around him. But he loved people. I love Joe. I'm blessed for knowing him, and I wish he would have lived to 120. And then 20 more years after that, and 20 more after that. But I'm so grateful to Joe for all that he taught me about music, and most importantly, about living life.
Neil has known Joe longer than I have. They also met on a ship. Another New Yorker, he was the pianist's best friend, a really good bass player. Right. A dear friend, and now an accomplished acupuncturist in Seattle and in Bainbridge, as well as still a very good bass player, Neil Conity.
First off, I'd like to say, to echo that pretty much everything I was going to say has already been said. I did have all of those lessons that Steve had. I was taught all of those things. But about 40 years ago, I got a gig on a cruise ship going from New York to Alaska through the Panama Canal. I was playing in a quintet with two other great musicians that I knew from New York. We were in a 2-story ballroom, beautiful ballroom, playing music for dancing. And there was a little soundproof door, and beyond that door was a little lounge where Joe was playing a single. He was the late night piano player. He would come on at about 10 o'clock and play till 2, just singing and playing piano. And so we met Joe like around the second day of the cruise, and we're all inseparable after that, going to the beach every day or hiking in Alaska, depending on where we were, and talking about music, or in the cabin listening to music. So anyway, I was with him for the entire 6 weeks, and it was just great. So many lessons from Joe. One of the first things I remember him saying to us is he says, when I meet somebody,
I want to tell them, I want to assure them I will never hurt you. And that doesn't mean he won't tell you uncomfortable truths, but he really he was this big, strong, intense guy, but so gentle. So gentle. So I have an impersonation of Joe, which dates probably from the second or third day I knew him. It's not very good, but if you told Joe about something you did or about something good that happened, he'd go, "Yeah, that's great. That's great." That's the whole thing. So we were in this quintet, and there was a singer in the quintet who she didn't really fit in with us. You know, she was kind of more of a pop singer. She didn't do jazz or anything. And we were kind of frustrated because we were playing music for dancing, and we didn't get, we were serious jazz musicians. We didn't get to play the jazz we wanted to play. And Joe talked to the cruise director and said, we got some jazz musicians on this boat. We should put on a little jazz concert. And he arranged this thing and had a huge turnout, mostly people who had been hanging out in the lounge listening to Joe play. Huge turnout, and we all, did our jazz things, and then at the end of it, he called up the singer that we had been playing with, and he played "Ain't Misbehavin' with Her," which she sang beautifully, and then he did like 3 or 4 Barbra Streisand tunes with her. I was like, hey, she's actually a pretty good singer, which we'd been working with her for about 5 weeks at that point. So I got off the boat. Joe stayed on. He had a longer contract, and when he got back, he called me and said, "Hey, you want to go bird watching?" I was like, "Why does he want to go bird watching with me?" Because he was Joe Baque. Anyway, I went up to Pleasantville where he was living, and we went bird watching, and we talked about things and looked at birds, and we talked a lot about music. He started teaching me things about music. We talked about politics, which it was the Reagan era, so there was a lot to talk about. But his talk about politics was always really more about ethics, about how is this affecting people, and what is the right way to treat people. And he always talked about living in fear, and how fear distorts everything and makes people cruel, and that you had to live with no fear. You had to let go of that. I loved playing with him. We had lots of gigs in New York. He taught me so much about music. He taught me about time, about swinging, about how right music could feel, and about connection. But he also taught me about counterpoint and serial composition. It was like, he was encyclopedic about music. Every time I played with him, I would learn the right changes to another tune. He'd move his fingers before he'd play. He would just kind of hover his fingers over the piano, right? And then bang, that left hand, like a cannon, he'd hit that bass note and start playing "Let's Fall in Love." And I would just be smiling for the whole gig, right up until we played "Show Me the Way to Go Home." And he had that gigantic left hand, so strong, but he never, Steve will back me up on this, never got in the way of the bass player. I don't know how he did it. Yeah. So, always played New York, New York, and always played anything anybody requested. And if they requested a song from a Broadway show, he would play the whole show. So there's one more story I want to tell about Joe. We were playing in a 6-piece band. It wasn't his gig. It wasn't my gig. It was a 6-piece band, and all great musicians. And we're playing, and I thought, hey, this sounds pretty good. We get to the break. Joe's like, nah, it's not happening. It's not. There's no connection. There's no connection. I don't know what's going on. So he goes up to the leader and says, "Hey, man, how you doing?" And they start talking. and he steers the conversation around to when he was a kid. And the leader's saying, yeah, when I was a kid, I had this rock collection. I had this one rock. I just loved that rock. And he goes, yeah, that's great. You made a connection. You made a connection with that rock. And the guy says, yeah, I guess I did. And within seconds, Joe just walked away. It was done, right? We get back up to play. And now all of a sudden the music is so great. He just looked at me and was like, yeah. Made that connection. So, thank you.
I love that. When Joe was not getting out toward the end of his life, Susan came to be with him every week. And if I went out shopping or working out when she was there, I would get home, and the two of them would just be locked in conversation across the table every time I would get home. All the great things about Susan distilled to this: beautiful musician and a truly wonderful friend to both Joe and me. The best. This is Susan Patrick.
I met Joe because I went to Yenny's. And I told Chuck Stentz that I wanted to play jazz piano. And he said, well, he handed me a card and he said, call this guy Joe Baque. And I called him and he said, bring some music. I'll meet you at Yenny's and we'll see. Well, that's enough to put you on edge. And so I go and I play, and then he plays. And so finally he said, after about an hour and 15 minutes, he said, okay, we'll give it a try. So I go the next week, and he looks at me and he says, well, what song do you want to learn to play? And I'm expecting him to be like a teacher and say, get this book. And no. So I just said the first thing that popped into my head was, When I Fall in Love. And he said, oh, okay. So he writes the melody out. And then he writes the bass line for the first eight bars, and then he says, okay, you fill in the rest of it, and I'll see you next week. And I wasn't quite, well, okay, I did it. And so then that went on for a while, and finally one day, he turned around to me and he said, if you can't fill up half the room, this is not gonna work. And I am just like, I think it was the equivalent, I'm not gonna be your dad, kind of thing. And so I go home with the next song, and I come back and that week I come back and I have conviction about what I wrote. And so it went on from there. And a few years ago, we were having one of our conversations, and I reminded him about him saying, well, you have to fill up half the room. And he just sat there and looked at me, and all of a sudden he said, well, I'll be good for me. Okay. And so when I first started taking lessons from him, it was shortly after Carol and Joe had gotten John. And so John would be taking his nap during my lesson. And then my lesson sort of ended when John woke up. And so then I'd go in and sort of play with them and everything, and step on the Legos and all of that. And gradually, I became more of a friend. And so a few years ago, he had told me a story once about working with Sheila Jordan, a wonderful singer from New York, when they were both really young and playing in a gay bar. So I had gone to a music camp, and Sheila Jordan was there, and I met her. And a friend of mine was going to have a jazz house concert in Seattle, and Sheila was the entertainment. So I said to him, "Oh, guess what? Why don't you go with me to see Sheila Jordan?" And his reply was, "Well, when I was a young man, I might not have been the nicest guy." And so I don't think so. So I talked to Carol about it, and between the two of us, we talked him into going. So he goes, and the guy that's handling the concert says, "Okay, I'll sneak you back, and you can talk to Sheila at intermission, and then, and you can tell her he's here." So I go back, and I tell her that I brought her a blast from the past, and that I brought Joe Baque. She tears by me, runs out into the room screaming, "Joey Baque, where are you?" And he stands up, and she's yelling at the guy in his house saying, "You get that piano cleared off. He's going to play with me right now." And Joe goes and plays. Of course, it works out wonderfully. But he comes off, and he looks at Carol, and I said, "Was that all right?" And we're going, "Oh, yeah, it was more than all right." And he said, "I'm never going to let you two talk me into anything." So then, a few years later, I watched him, and he went up to Tacoma, and every week, and he saw Dave Knutson, who was on the faculty at PLU. And I heard he would tell me about that sometimes at one of my lessons. And then I saw him do the same thing with Jack Percival. And I thought to myself, watching this man, and just gentle, kind man, I thought, someday I'm going to do that. And I had the good fortune to do that with Joe. The other guy had Tuesdays with Maury. I had Wednesdays with Joe. We talked. We would sit down at the table. Carol would leave. We would reach across the table, hold hands for a minute. And it was like that holding hands took us into this deep dive. And we would talk about philosophy and religion and relationships and music and what we believed, and kindness, of course, and gratitude. And it was like a life lesson every week. And I would come home, I would walk out of there feeling so calm and so full, and so many of you have experienced that. And eventually it got to the point that Carol and Joe and John would come for Christmas. And he became my family, our family, for Jim and I both. And that was a great gift, a great gift. And when we finish, I'm going to give a blessing, which I think summarizes many of the things that I learned from him and that we all did. And so thank you.
That's a real friend, providing Kleenexes with something like this. Yeah. If you saw the pictures from Joe's New Yorkers in Olympia 100th birthday a year ago today celebration, then you saw Joe surrounded by a whole lot of really beautiful women, his nieces from New York. Anne has known and loved Joe longer than anyone else here, all her life. Thank you, Anne and Bob, for coming from New York to be with us and with Joe here and representing your amazing family. This is Anne Soldano.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ann Soldano, and I am honored to speak today about my beloved Uncle Joe. Joe was my mother's older brother and the most special uncle to my 7 siblings and me. Growing up in Queens Village, New York, and I apologize for my New York accent in advance, he was a constant presence in our lives. In fact, one of my favorite memories as a young girl was waking up to Uncle Joe sleeping on our living room couch after a late night of playing with his band at some wedding, bar mitzvah, or other event. As I think about it now, I'm not exactly sure what he was thinking at the time, because the Starris house with its 8 kids was not a place to go if you needed to get some rest. As soon as the first set of feet would descend the stairs, up Uncle Joe would be, sitting at the kitchen table with all of us for breakfast. And after a few cups of coffee, he was ready for the family band to assemble in the living room. Out came his accordion and electric keyboard. My siblings and father played their guitars, my mother her violin, and the youngest banged on lots of pots and pans with wooden spoons because, of course, Uncle Joe insisted we needed a percussion section. Over the years, this motley band grew in number as my siblings and I married and had children of our own, some of whom we say inherited the Uncle Joe musical genes. We never tired of our little family concerts, no matter how many times we played and sang "You Are My Sunshine" and "Good Night, Irene." Each time was magical, special. We treasured this time with Uncle Joe, and to this day, I am so grateful to him for being such an important part of a family tradition that exhilarated us when we celebrated important life events together, but also held us up when we endured sadness and loss. The last time our little family bands gathered was just a little over a year ago in February 2022. My siblings and I came to Olympia from New York to celebrate my uncle's 100th birthday with Carol and John. I will never forget how Uncle Joe sat at that piano and played song after song, while my sister Maria and brother-in-law Chris accompanied him on their guitars. It was like we were back in our Queens Village living room. And true to Uncle Joe form, he did not need sheet music. He did not need to practice to refresh his memory. He just played. And played he did at almost 100 years old. I don't think there was a dry eye in that house that night because once again, it was magical and it was special. I think that all of us here tonight would agree that my Uncle Joe truly valued and treasured the relationships he had with people. Whether you knew him for a brief period of time or for many years, he always made you feel that you were important to him, that you mattered to him. There were no distractions when you were in his presence. No looking at cell phones, no multitasking. You were simply with him, and he was with you. My mother and he had such a special sibling relationship despite their 12-year age difference. And even after Uncle Joe and Carol moved to the West Coast, that did not stop my mother from getting on a plane by herself and flying across the country, probably well into her 70s, to visit her big brother. As I reflected on my uncle's life since his passing, I asked myself the question, what can I possibly do to honor this man who has meant so much to me and who has been such an important part of my life? And the answer is really quite simple. Live every day like he did. Be humble, be kind and compassionate, especially to those who need it the most. Live each day with positivity and gratitude. Take care of our planet Earth. Always be open to learning new things. Do not be fearful. Have faith in yourself. Be still, be quiet, and trust your inner voice. Laugh and cry, and don't forget to play and have some fun. My Uncle Joe never had to say a lot for his words to impact you in a very profound and deep way. As I said goodbye to him last February, of course in tears, he held me close and said, "We trust and love each other. The family is strong." This is the legacy that both he and my mother have left us, one that we will proudly honor for the rest of our lives. In closing, I would like to read a poem by Maya Angelou entitled, "When Great Trees Fall." You, Uncle Joe, have been and will always be our family's great tree. When great trees fall, rocks on distant hills shudder. Lions hunker down in tall grasses, and even elephants lumber after safety. When great trees fall in forests, small things recoil into silence, their senses eroded beyond fear. When great souls die, the air around us becomes light, rare, sterile. We breathe briefly. Our eyes briefly see with a hurtful clarity. Our memory, suddenly sharpened, examines, gnaws on kind words unsaid, promised walks never taken. Great souls die, and our reality, bound to them, takes leave of us. Our souls, dependent upon their nurture, now shrink, wizened. Our minds, formed and informed by their radiance, fall away. We are not so much maddened as reduced to the unutterable ignorance of dark, cold caves. And when great souls die, after a period, peace blooms. Slowly and always irregularly. Spaces fill with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses restored, never to be the same, whisper to us. They existed. They existed. We can be and be better, for they existed. Thank you.
Our wonderful and so loved son, John. John Baque.
My dad always told me to take a deep breath. Over the last year or so of my father's life, our conversations would always come back to how thankful he was for the wonderful life he lived. This was something that wasn't so secret about him. He was filled with gratitude. So thank you all for being here today. It means the world to my mother and I. Thank you, Cousin Ann, for that amazing speech. Thank you to the town of Olympia for welcoming my father with open arms 39 years ago into this community, and letting him make a second career here when he met my mom. Thank you for making this a magical place for us to be a family. We do not look like a typical family. My parents almost having 30 years between them, and then me being adopted and having different skin color than them. But we definitely are connected on a molecular level, and we are all three of us hardheads. So we definitely are connected in that way. A huge thank you to my father for taking on fatherhood. I didn't realize until the end of his life how much being a father was important to him his whole adult life. He actually fostered over 70 children, and he also obviously loved waking up to a tackle of my cousins in the morning. So being a father was important to him, and he yearned to be a father. So when he and my hard-headed mother decided to be, well, actually she decided that they were going to be parents, I was shocked to hear that he was actually reluctant. But I guess that was only because he felt it was going to be unfair to me or whoever the child would be because of his age, and how wrong he was. At age 68, he took on fatherhood. And wow, because I'm tired and I'm 34. No kids, no pets, one job. So, my mom shared with me this story that the adoption agency had them read this book because I was an older child when they were adopting me. I was 2 at the time. And the adoption agency was concerned that I would not have the proper foundation because I had been without a mother figure for the first 2 years of my life. And the analogy they used was to keep putting bricks onto the foundation whenever things would go wrong. And so another thank you and a huge amount of gratitude for my father for continuing to build me up my whole life. He kept putting bricks there and saving my life on so many occasions. So I think we could all agree that my life could have and would have turned out a lot differently had one of those things and a long line of events gone differently. So I'm the luckiest kid in the world. My father accomplished one of his biggest life goals, which was overcoming and ending the lifelong trauma he had with that his father imparted on him, because we were best friends. He was and is still my best friend. Thank you to my extended family, my cousins, my aunts, my uncles. My father's, one of his largest desires was to have a strong family, and he had to work intentionally and hard at this. So we did it. We trust and love each other, and the family is strong. And finally, to my mother, thank you.
You know, we always joked growing up that my mom was the only one who still needed a cover story on the local paper here. For whatever reason, my father and I had, you know, for my sports and his piano playing had been on it. And I think it's time for her to have hers, Queen Carol. She's a pretty cool lady. I really do hope the community gets to know more about her, the cool life she's lived. She summited Mount Rainier. She helped start one of the first voicemail companies in our dining room. And now she lobbies the state government for pension rights. So she's pretty fearless. Mom, none of this would have been possible without you. Your loving care of my father and Papa, allowed him to spend his final years and months and days at home. I know he fought so hard to be around because he just loved spending time with you. And you gave us that gift, especially me. And you transcended 100 years of life. At the end of his life, he still called out for you. So you're the love of his life. So thank you all again for being here. And without further rambling, I will introduce to you my mother, Carol Baque.
Wow. We've heard a lot of lists today, but I think that's partly because there are just so many things that Joe imparted to us, and just to talk about a couple of them just never seems enough. So I have another list. These are the things that I learned from Joe. The power of facing each day and each person with joy. The peace in trusting your medical providers, and he trusted them implicitly. The value of writing things down. The importance of supporting people who are doing the right thing. The art of improvisation, and here I have to put a little story in. We had a couple of Acuras that we got used, and they were really good for road cars for Joe for going to gigs. But they were really low to the ground. And so when I drove one of them, I was always going to stores and in parking lots, and as one does in a parking lot, I ran over the curb a lot, right? And of course, you don't know that you're running over the curb until you hear that grinding sound, right? And in which case you put it into reverse and you back up, right? And the bumper, of course, separates a little bit more from the car each time you do that, right? So I was driving home from work one day in the Acura, and the darn bumper just fell off. It was the front bumper, too. And it was big. I mean, this was a huge bumper. It wasn't something I could just leave in the road or anything. And I was right next to a convenience store, so I pulled over and I called Joe. What else could I do, right? I mean, and so he said to me, "I'll be right there." And he was, but I had neglected to ask him to bring anything to help fix the bumper, right? Well, that didn't dissuade him at all. He went into the convenience store, and he bought them out of shoelaces. I remember distinctly there was one sneaker lace package and one boot lace package. He took them out of the packages and he tied them together, the two laces, and he leaned under the where the bumper belonged in the car, and he held up the bumper, and he tied that bumper onto that car so you would never know that it wasn't connected. And we drove it that way for months. Nobody knew. I just love it. Another thing he taught me, the comfort of pets, especially dogs. I think he had about 11 dogs in his life, all rescue dogs. The joy of language. We used to have these nerd-like discussions about the origins of this word or that word or something, and I mean, it would probably bored everybody else in here, but we had a terrific time with it. The peace and beauty of nature, the beauty of flowers, the transformational power of music, the joy when it swings, the importance of every note, the joy of working toward the mastery of something, the necessity to listen, the importance of building wisdom and passing it on, the excitement of learning new things, the importance of being present in every moment, the satisfaction of passing up the chance to show off and helping another person to look or sound good, knowing what gifts to accept and what, like love and support, and knowing what gifts to reject, like guilt or disrespect. The courage to stand up and sometimes to walk away. The eternal value of family. The importance of being kind. The importance of building friendships and keeping them. The rejuvenating power of parenting. The peace of acceptance and forgiveness. The sublime power of unconditional love. And that caring for someone is the most sacred thing we can do. If you haven't already spent some time at the photos out in the lobby, picture boards, I encourage you to do so because they say a lot about the different facets of Joe. I'll color them in with a few more stories now. There are not a lot of pictures of Joe's childhood in Queens. That's partly because photos then were not nearly as easy to take as they are now, but also because Joe did not talk a lot about his childhood. His school experience was like this. He'd take his textbooks home at the beginning of every year, he'd read them all, and then he'd goof off for the rest of the year. He said he drove his teachers crazy because he'd score really well on those New York Regents exams, and they would have to pass him. And his grandmother lived with them, and so German was actually either his first or his second language, depending on how you define that. His father made false teeth, and so the family did pretty well during the Depression, because people had to eat, right? His father was not a nice man, but they did get him a piano, which is still in our home. That's the Chickering. And he got him lessons, too. He liked music, and it was probably the only thing that he and his father had in common. When Joe was 13, a guy from a bar up the street knocked on their door and said he'd heard there was a kid here who could play piano. It was New Year's Eve, and their piano player had shown up drunk. But it was the beginning of a career. Schools accelerated good students in the 30s, and Joe graduated at 16. His parents sent him to NYU, for which he was completely unprepared. He said whole weeks went by that he didn't remember a thing. And to his parents' horror, he actually dropped out. Although I'm going to hasten to add here that his respect for education grew considerably during the years, and he did get a degree with a double major in psychology and music 40 years later. But the good part of his dropping out of college was that it got him out of the house and away from his father. He hung out with musicians, got a room and a girl in Harlem, played gigs and rent parties, and visited his mother when his father wasn't there. And once when he was hungry, he had 5 cents in his pocket and no job prospects. He weighed whether to spend that nickel on transportation home and a meal, or to get something to eat in front of him. He spent the nickel on an egg cream, which is like a soda, and he never lived home again. He played with lots of bands. The photos show show Joe with a pencil-thin mustache, I love that mustache, playing vibes with Patty Travers and her Men About Town. All right? A photo that actually appeared in Billboard magazine at the time. He played lots of ethnic parties. Early on, before he had built a repertoire, he was playing, he was in a band that played Hava Nagila, and then they started playing some other popular tunes. And the guy who had hired them came over and said, no, 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 only Jewish music. Well, the band only knew that one song. They only knew Hava Nagila, right? So they played that one song all night. And I'm trying to imagine the agony of band members playing the same song all night, right? He also played after hours with members of Duke Ellington's and other bands. And one of them, as I think Denise referred to, chided him for showing off. And he said, hey, kid, when you have it, we make you sound good. When we have it, you make us sound good. And it was a lesson he never forgot. He built a repertoire, incredible repertoire. He played parties for the rich and famous and debutantes, and he was in the Lester Lannon Band. You've probably seen him if you watch any of the PBS oldies kind of shows. At one such party, and I'm going to embroider on the story that Denise told about the beret here. At one such party, an entitled guest asked him why he wore the beret. And Joe had gotten this question before, and usually he could stop them by answering, because it pleases me. But that didn't stop this guy. How much for the beret? He asked. Joe says, it's not for sale. But the guy wouldn't stop. Everything's for sale, he said. He turned to the other guests at the party. We're going to have an auction for this man's beret, he announced. He started the bidding, and the bidding was lively, and it got up to like $3,000. Now, this was a long time ago, and that was a whole lot of money. The band leader came over to Joe, and he said, look, this has gone far enough. Just take the money. But Joe said, no. And he turned to the auctioneer, and he said, you can't even have my little fingernail for $3,000. And then he took his beret off, and he handed it to the guy. Joe always knew his worth. He had a thriving vocal coaching business in his studio, which was over the Carnegie Deli in Manhattan. He worked with great singers and high-priced call girls looking for a career after they had aged. And he worked with a whole lot of Broadway stars, and he conducted for them when they were on TV. He had chances at fame, but he was unimpressed by it. He had gotten really good at the vibes. He had this 4-mallet technique on the vibes where he was going like this and that with the mallets, playing chords and whatnot on the vibes. And he had caught the attention of the vibes player for George Shearing's band, a woman named Margie Hyams. And Margie Hyams was about to leave George Shearing, and she recommended Joe to take her place in the band. And he got the offer, but he didn't take the job, because by then he'd gotten married, and he did not want to be gone all the time. Joe also knew the worth of a family. He was a professional, and he stood up for himself, and he stood up for his profession, but he also took volunteer gigs if he really believed in the cause or in the person. He studied with a concert pianist, Emil Friedberger. That's how he got that beautiful sound that he had every time he touched the keys. It was just gorgeous. He studied composition, as Denise said, with a student of Arnold Schoenberg and Alban Berg. And that's how he got his ability to transpose on the fly, to arrange, to improvise, and compose. He composed 2 musicals, one about Poe and one about Professor Pennywhistle, which was put on in children's theater. And he actually taught at the New School in New York when it was still a new school. Right? He practiced every day. He'd work on a classical piece, and I want to borrow from a letter that I got from one of Joe's students. She said, "He had such a fierce love of a note played purposefully. I remember him telling me, when I set out to learn a piece, I go through it note by note to decide how I want it to sound. And then I exact that from my fingers." And then he went on, "To illustrate, let me play for you a part of a Brahms piece that I've been working on for 18 years. Seriously. Yeah. He learned to play ragtime when he was 64 after he moved here. He never played ragtime before. He joined a blues rock band, Sour Owl, when he was 87 and had a great time with them. They loved him. I remember Lynn from Sour Owl at our house to go over his original songs that the band was playing, so Joe would know them better. And Joe was transcribing what Lynn was playing on his guitar. And Joe would say, "Oh, you have a measure of 4 here, and then a measure of 5, and here's a measure of 7. But then he'd say, "But don't change a thing. It's right." And he meant it. Right? He went to sea and went around the world 3 times and back and forth from Vancouver to Alaska 20 times. It was on one of those sea journeys that I met him. I remember talking to him in one of the ship's cafes. It was in the back of the ship, and it had a view of the water, and it was a rainy day. And I remember looking out the windows at the rain and the water and being amazed that he was actually listening to what I was saying. He replied thoughtfully and quietly and intently, and he always gave me the space to speak. I had never met anybody like that, and I fell hard. He had the courage to move to Olympia and to marry me. He was always a New Yorker, but he definitely became an Olympian also. We were an odd couple here at first, as John pointed out. He was 28 years older than I was. But it didn't take long for Joe to make good friends and for the town to fall in love with him and for us as a couple to become old hat. 2 years later, I was itching to adopt a child. And at first, Joe wasn't sure, as John said. But he could see I had my heart set on it. Yeah, he used to call us Joe Hardhead, Carol Hardhead, and John Hardhead. But he also recognized a longing in himself as well. So we applied to WACAP, W-A-C-A-P, which they kept changing what it stood for. I don't remember. But it was based in Renton, and it was adoption agency. Joe was 66 years old. We got a call from WACAP. "We've never had anyone your age go through our process before. Would you come in for a meeting?" And I got to tell you, I was well prepared for that meeting. I had reasons up one side and down the other why he would be a great dad, and his age was an advantage and not a bad thing. But, we got to that meeting. I needn't have bothered to do any of that, because we got to that meeting, and as soon as we sat down, Joe started. He started telling them about how he had had 74 different foster children over 8 years, and all the useful things he had learned with each experience, things like how listening to Mozart calms down an overactive child, right? And they're sitting at the table and they're going, they interrupted and they said, "Well, we're going to send your application in right now." And 2 years later, we went to Thailand and sat before a Thai government panel on a raised dais. If this is where we were sitting, the dais was like way up there, and it went round like that. And they were all sitting in this grand position over us. And we assured them that we wanted and already loved and respected this 2-year-old child. They were impressed that Joe was a musician, and I remember kind of going like this, saying, "How does that feel?" Right? Their king was a musician. He played clarinet. "And so you think you can handle this?" they asked us. And Joe says, "No problem." And they all started laughing. And that's when they told us that their prime minister always said in their meetings in English, "No problem." So I gave Joe another nudge, and I said, "Way to go." All right? Well, John earned a whole line of admirers on the flight home. People just fell in love with you, kiddo, which was packed with refugees. When we got home, we introduced him to our 4 dogs, one at a time. John was great with all of them, and they were great with him. And I was working, so Joe was the hands-on parent for all of John's childhood. And what a time they had. Oh my goodness. Walks, swims, trips, ice cream cones, car rides, acrobatics at home, and many things I'm just now finding out that they did together. When John wanted to swim, Joe, who was a strong swimmer, as our neighbors with a view of Ward Lake can testify, because he used to swim almost all the way across the lake and back, and he did that until he was almost 100. Joe was there with him, and there at his lessons, and there at his meets, and he was always in John's camp with his gentle presence. He drove with me to Utah, where John was swimming for the university there. He was so proud when John graduated from college. We both were. And when John got to be on his own, it was really hard for me to get used to. But Joe knew just how to comfort me. He knew what to say and do. Joe and I went to New York to see his sisters, and for John to get to know his cousins just about every year. During one of our visits after John had moved out of the house, we made a wonderful trip to Manhattan, riding subways and buses and touring the Metropolitan and the Museum of Modern Art. And Joe showed me where his village apartment had been. It had actually been joined to another building by this time, and so the address didn't exist anymore, but he showed me where it had been. And he led me to where the poet E.E. Cummings had lived. It was not easy to find, but he remembered it exactly. It was nestled into a cranny of Greenwich Village. Joe had a number of books when I met him, but among them a book of E.E. Cummings' poetry. And I'd like to read one of those to close this. And when I'm done, Susan is going to offer a blessing. The poem is called "I Carry Your Heart." I carry your heart with me. I carry it in my heart. I am never without it. Anywhere you go, my dear, and whatever is done by only me is your doing, my darling. I fear no fate, for you are my fate, my sweet. I want no world, for beautiful you are my world, my true. And it's you are, whatever a moon has always meant, and whatever a sun will always sing, is you. Here is the deepest secret nobody knows. Here is the root of the root and the bud of the bud and the sky of a tree called life, which grows higher than soul can hope or mind can hide. And this is the wonder that's keeping the stars apart. I carry your heart. I carry it in my heart. Thanks.
And to finish this evening off, I say to you this blessing for each of us. And as I said before, I feel like a lot of this embodies things I learned from Joe. It is also something I did with him at the very end of his life. May the powers of the universe be with you in your mind and your thinking. May the powers of the universe be with you in your eyes and your seeing. May the powers of the universe be with you in your ears and your hearing. And may the powers of the universe be with you in your mouth and your speaking. May the powers of the universe be with you in your heart and your understanding. May the powers of the universe be with you in your life and your living. May the powers of the universe be with you at your end and your departing, as we all merge and become part of the great river of energy that connects us all. Namaste.
Once again, thank you all for coming. I'm moved by all of you. Thank you. And the party goes on for another hour or so if we want it to. There's food over there and pictures here and wonderful people in this room. So thank you all.